I've spotted some pretty interesting stuff when looking at the PC system requirements for Dying Light the Beast. Now, this game is, as far as I can tell, using Techland's own proprietary C engine, since this game did start development originally as like an expansion to Dying Light 2, which actually pushed a lot of visuals there using their own proprietary engine. There was a lot of pretty advanced, especially for when it launched, ray tracing features, etc. It has its own pretty beefy system requirements. But anyway, this has become its own game with its own release date, which is being pushed out to September 19th. I believe it was originally slated for an August release, but had a little bit of a delay. But what I've noticed in here that's really grabbing my attention is Nvidia Reflex 2 being listed as a latency optimization, along with AMD's Anti-Lag 2 and Intel Xe low latency. But I really want to mention that they put Reflex 2. Now, it's possible this is a typo, but this is interesting because Nvidia has announced Reflex 2 a long time ago. I think back in January. We're going on like at least 7 months ago, I think, for when they announced this. And they talked about it in the finals and Valorant. However, as far as I can tell, and I even asked Google to double check me, the actual patches for Valorant and the finals haven't actually launched with Reflex 2 in it. And the latest articles I could find on the topic are saying that Reflex 2 still has no actual release date, and yet Dying Light 2 has a release date of September 19th, and their system requirements chart is listing Reflex 2. So that's pretty interesting. Again, though, I'm wondering if this is a typo. System requirements do sometimes have typos. For example, I'm pretty sure on CPUs that there is a Ryzen 7 5800, but I don't remember there being an F version. Now, maybe there is, but it's rather obscure. But anyway, the point is this could be just a typo, but in case it's not, let's talk a little bit about Reflex 2. This is interesting. So it's very different than Reflex 1, actually very, very different. Reflex 1 basically just optimizes the render queue between the CPU and the GPU so that your mouse input, your inputs to the game, queue up as nicely as possible with it reaching the display. And so there's less of a delay in between, for example, clicking to shoot and that response actually being processed and presented to the display. Reflex 2 does something completely different. What this does is this actually warps the frame right before it's sent to the display. By taking, so like you do your movement and then the normal processing queue gets started, but then right before it gets sent to the display, they actually take an even more up-to-date like mouse position. And then they bend the frame to align better to your latest mouse position, making it feel like the game is actually responding to an even more up-to-date user input, which is pretty interesting. But wait, you might be like, if they warp the frame, couldn't that cause some image quality problems? And the answer is yes. And I'm wondering if that's why we still haven't seen this in a public release. On this technology. So now what they do to try to fix this is called inpainting. So if you run with inpainting off, you'll notice that anytime something is uncovered, that was, because if you move the mouse, right, something would be uncovered, but the game's not actually rendering what was uncovered. It's just warping the frame, which means there's a gap to fill in. So they use inpainting to just fill in the gaps of what's going on there. Now, initially, that was being reported as being, done through AI, but the latest I could find on the topic was, I think I forget who the creator was, but asking NVIDIA engineers at a GDC conference a few months ago whether AI was actually being used for the inpainting, and they said no. It was just kind of using the colors that are nearby to fill in those gaps. So it's not super visually irritating. Anyway, I really want to try this out, so I'm hoping this game is really getting it. But again, could just be a typo in the system requirements. We'll have to see. Now, speaking of the system requirements, another thing I want to mention is there's a whole nother sheet of laptop system requirements. Now, I'm sure that this isn't the first game to have had its own laptop system requirements spec sheet, but it's the first one that I'm aware of. I covered the major, game releases, system requirements for the last 4 or 5 years pretty thoroughly, and I don't remember seeing any laptop spec sheets. So that's pretty interesting, and I'll mention that again at the end of the video. But for now, let's go ahead and jump into the actual main event on the spec sheet. So one nice thing here is that they are giving us performance and graphic settings targets, which is so important. So we know not just that it's the minimum requirements, but we know that by minimum, they mean you get 1080p 30 FPS at low settings. Or for recommended, you get 1440p 60 FPS at medium settings. High settings are for 4K 60 at high. And the ultra system requirements are 4K 60 at ultra with RT, but they're also saying here that this includes frame generation. I'm assuming then that that means using frame generation just to hit 60 FPS, which is never a great situation. So ideally I would imagine you would actually have something even more powerful than this for those settings. But anyway, let's go ahead and jump in on some of the specific details, which is also that there's no upscaling listed as being used in these specifications, but that doesn't mean it isn't. In a lot of system requirements charts I've seen, they list a graphic settings preset, which once you actually get a hold of the game, you find out that that graphic settings preset is actually using upscaling by default, and the system requirements chart never explicitly stated that it was using upscaling. That being said, if you do have to rely on upscaling in this game, it is at least having all of the main technologies available, including FSR4 for compatible hardware, as well as DLSS4 and Intel's XeSS2, and they're mentioning that both the upscaler and frame generation is available for all of those technologies. So that's good news for that support. They're also mentioning ultra-wide support, which is it's a little annoying when games don't have that, so that at least they're calling out that it does have it. They're again mentioning that the game does have some advanced ray tracing technologies like global illumination and reflections, which did look pretty good in Dying Light 2 when I took a look at that game when it launched. Again, all the latency optimizations, etc. Now, what kind of hardware do you need to hit these specs? So for 1080p 30 FPS at low settings, potentially with upscaling enabled, but we don't know that for sure, they're saying just a GTX 1060 or a Radeon RX 5500 XT or an Intel Arc A750. Now, the Arc A750 here feels a little bit out of place to me. Here's why. Also, if your GPU isn't listed, this could be a useful resource for you. I'll try to remember to link it in the video description. This is Tech PowerUp's GPU database. And in it, you can check out a relative performance chart. Now, it's not perfect, and it's also not necessarily going to be accurate to any particular game, because it's sometimes in certain games, a certain GPU brand or architecture outperforms or underperforms compared to its typical average results. So this is more of a typical average result. And again, it's not perfect. However, the GTX 1060 6GB and the RX 5500 XT are within a few percent of each other in general, so those feel like they make sense to pair up. However, we'd have to scroll up significantly to see the A750 from Intel. By the way, maybe if you're spotting your GPU around here, maybe you've got an RX 580 or you've got a 1650 Super. You're in the same general performance category, so actually let me zoom in slightly here. Maybe you'll spot your GPU along the way if you're kind of in this general ballpark. As the percentages increase, you can see that you would be getting a little bit better than what they're listing for 1080p 30 low settings. So either increasing graphics settings or frame rate or resolution. But notice that we got to scroll up quite a ways to get to the Arc A750. It's listed as 87% more powerful than the GTX 1060. Now, sometimes Arc GPUs underperform, but the fact that they're even testing them and putting them on the system requirements sheet indicates that there's actually been some thought put towards their optimization. But again, that just seems a little bit out of place here, and I wanted to call that out. I'm not quite sure why it's so out of place. Now, the other thing I want to mention before we move on to more GPUs on the higher settings is look at these minimum CPU requirements. A 13400F or a Ryzen 7 5800F. That is so far more powerful than what you would expect to be paired up with these types of GPUs. A GTX 1060, I would expect that to be paired with maybe like a 8400F from Intel or earlier, even older than that. You know, a Ryzen 7 5800. Again, a lot newer and more powerful than what you would typically have paired with these GPUs. So if you have one of these GPUs, don't think you're necessarily good if you don't have a fairly beefy CPU, if these CPU requirements are anything to believe. Because honestly, I'm hoping these are overstated, because that's kind of crazy. The 13400F is actually a pretty new chip. This is 10 cores, 16 threads, although not all of that is you know, the P cores that you'd actually be using for the gaming. But this came out in 2023. So that's, you know, a fairly new chip. You know, the performance cores are just 6 core, and then it has the efficiency cores. But then we can also pop over to the 5800. However, I was searching the Tech PowerUp CPU database to see if I could find a 5800F version, and I didn't see any 5800F version. There's a 5800X and a 5800XT and a 5800X3D. So I'm just going to assume they meant the 5800X and that they accidentally left an F in there. But this is an 8-core, 16-thread part. Again, from fairly recently. Now, this is 2020, but this was one of the higher end parts from that generation. Again, launch price was like a $450 CPU at the time. So do keep all of that in mind when we're looking at these system requirements. Also, one more thought on the minimum specs. They're mentioning GPU memory of at least 6 gigabytes. The 1060 had a 3 gigabyte version. If that's the one you've got, not good enough. Also, the 5500 XT had a 4 gigabyte version and an 8 gigabyte version. If we're judging by these system requirements, the 4 gigabyte version's not going to cut it. So keep all of that in mind. Now, on the CPU side of things, notice that for recommended going up to 60 FPS, they're leaving the 13400F, but they're jumping the Ryzen CPU all the way up to a Ryzen 7 7700. This thing's basically current top of the line if you're not going X3D chips. This is an 8-core, 16-thread part from just a couple of years ago in 2023. And honestly, the 9700 didn't improve the gaming performance in any meaningful way compared to the 7700. So we're literally talking about absolute top of the line, other than the X3D parts, class performance here that they're asking on this type of CPU requirement. And notice that from there, it scales up to a 13700K or a 7800 X3D. Anyway, and past that, it goes to a 14900K and a 7950 X3D. So all I'm going to comment on is that I really hope that these CPU requirements are vastly overstated in this list. Because otherwise, I think a lot of people are going to have a hard time. There's a lot of people who do not have 5800 or 13400F class CPUs, and if that's just getting you 30 FPS, maybe 60 FPS on that 13400, that's just going to be a bit rough. Anyway, also an SSD requirement. Anyway, let's talk more GPUs though. So the recommended GPUs for 1440p 60 FPS at medium do jump up considerably, all the way from a GTX 1060, again 6 gigabyte version, up to a 3070 Ti or AMD RX 6750 XT, or an Intel Arc B580. So let's jump back to that Tech PowerUp chart and explore this a little bit. So the 1060, so remember, we already scrolled all the way up to look at an Arc A750 in that min requirement, mentioned that didn't really make sense, but let's keep going. So now you're getting up to cards like an RX 6650 XT, RX 7600, RTX 2080. Here's the B580, that's more than doubling the performance. That was the minimum requirement, but then we have to keep going if we're going to get to the to get to the AMD and Nvidia recommendations. So another place where the Intel requirements don't really seem to make sense to me, because notice that the A750 was like way higher than the other minimum GPUs, but now we're going to notice that the B580 is way weaker than the other recommended GPUs. So again, something just seems a little bit off here. But anyway, let's keep going until we get to those recommended GPUs. So going past the, here's the 6750 XT at 273% of the performance of our min spec 1060. And then we got to keep going to get to the 3070 Ti, which is usually more powerful than the 6750 XT, although not like mind-blowingly so. It's also only an 8GB GPU, so they are indicating 8GB should be okay here. If we set the 3070 Ti as the baseline, the 6750 XT is generally, around 90% of the performance of that. And then that B580 is around 74% of the performance of that. So there's definitely some wiggle room in the kinds of hardware that they're asking for with these settings. So that's interesting to note. They do call out at least 8GB for these settings. Again, the CPU requirement from AMD jumping there as well. Now, if we go up to the high settings for 4K 60, and we're also going up from medium settings now to high settings, but staying at 60 FPS but jumping to 4K resolution, we've got another pretty big jump, and notice that they're now asking for at least 12 gigabytes of VRAM. That's going to be both the resolution increase and the graphic settings increase that are likely asking for more VRAM. Also notice that the system RAM, they're now asking for 32 gigabytes rather than 16. Again, whether that's really necessary, we'll have to see, but that is what the system specs are stating. Now, they're saying jumping up to a 4070 Ti or a 7900 GRE. So if we have the 3070 Ti as the baseline, and then we scroll up, you'll notice, again, maybe you're spotting your GPU here somewhere. You'll notice the 7900 GRE isn't like that much more powerful. They're saying like 25% more powerful here, but it does have more VRAM, which could be factoring in. And then the 4070 Ti is 36% more powerful than the 3070 Ti. So this is interesting because again, the jump from 1440p 60 at medium to 4K 60 at high, I would expect to be a lot bigger jump than what we're seeing here, which tells me that either one of these settings doesn't make sense for its performance it's targeting, or I think more likely that there's resolution scaling involved in this. And I think that their 4K resolution is probably using performance mode upscaling. And that maybe their 1440p was only using like quality or balanced mode upscaling, and that explains the lack of increase in horsepower that they're asking for, but the settings and resolution increase, meaning that they do want GPUs with at least 12 gigabytes of VRAM. So that's kind of what I'm reading into this. Maybe I'm wrong. Let me know what you think in the comments section. And again, the 4070 Ti and the 7900 GRE aren't worlds apart, so they're at least in a somewhat realistic ballpark for two GPUs that you could put in roughly the same performance tier. Usually the 4070 Ti is more powerful. There's that. Now, if we jump up to Ultra with ray tracing, they're now increasing the requirements to a 5070 or a 9070. Interesting, also an Arc B580 is suddenly back in here but wasn't here, which is just completely outclassed. This doesn't make any sense to me. And they're also saying with frame generation to hit that 60. So, in other words, I don't think it really makes sense at all. Now, the 5070 isn't worlds above what we actually saw here. In fact, actually, the 5070 is roughly the same performance as the 4070 Ti. So the 5070 is roughly the same performance as the 4070 Ti. So is the 9070. But the 9070 is significantly better ray tracing performance compared to the 7900 GRE. So I think it makes sense why they've increased the AMD requirement for better ray tracing performance here by jumping to the newer generation where the 9000 series had way better ray tracing performance. But I think it's really strange that we have the Intel Arc B580 here. And again, the 5070 is probably kind of interchangeable here with the 4070 Ti. There's not usually a big... So really, I think what they're saying is if you turn on ray tracing, your performance goes down, but then you could kick frame generation back on. Anyway, and like I said, the CPU requirements then just look absolutely insane. So hopefully those are just incorrect. Now, the last thing I want to once again mention is that there are also laptop PC requirements here, which I think is really good to see. My channel focuses more on the desktop space, so I'm not going to have a lot to comment here other than, hey, take a look. I will also say that the CPU requirements here don't seem quite as insane in the sense that, like, well, I mean, they still look pretty high. Let's say that. They do still look pretty high. But, generally laptop CPUs aren't quite as performant as their desktop counterparts, indicating maybe the desktop ones were a little bit blown out of proportion, but hey, I don't know. We'll have to see. Now the GPU specs, again, you're looking at for 1080p 30 low, an RTX 3050 at 80 watts. You know, Intel Core Ultra. Wait, with an Arc 140V. So in other words, I think they're talking about some of the you know, integrated chips that could potentially play the game with their integrated graphics for 1080p 60 FPS medium. Notice this is different than in the desktop specs where it jumped up to 1440p 60 medium. They're saying an RTX 3080 laptop or an AMD Ryzen AI 9 370. Again, Ryzen is usually a CPU, but again, I'm not an expert in the laptop space. I'm assuming there's some integrated graphics here that could maybe go with this. Or are they saying that I don't know how to read this, guys. Now, the AMD Ryzen AI Max Plus 395, it has a huge APU in it. I do know that. I'm trying to get a mini PC that I can review with it just because it's interesting. Where it has like 40 compute units. It's absolutely massive. So there is that. Anyway, 4070 laptop. Anyway, that's for 1440p 60 high. Like I said, I'm not an expert in the laptop space, but here's those specs if you need it. All the sources will be in the video description. Hopefully you guys found the video useful and or interesting. I really hope that the Reflex 2 business isn't a typo and that it's actually in this game, and this gives us a chance to take a look at Reflex 2. But like I said, maybe that's just a typo. We'll find out when the game launches. Hope all of you have an excellent day.